All right. So let everyone join our webinar. Welcome to Powerhouse Arena's virtual events. My name is Chris, and I'm very pleased to be hosting the launch for Artifact by Arlene Heyman. Thank you everyone for coming. You'll be able to ask questions through the Q&A function on your screen throughout the event, and we'll take them at the end. You can also buy the book at powerhousebookstores.com. There it is. Posted the link in the chat. And it's also on the event page. And we'll also have links to Arlene's first book and Sandra's latest book as well. Arlene will be in conversation with Sandra Newman, and I'll introduce them now. Sandra Newman is the author of many works of fiction and nonfiction, most recently the novel The Heavens, which was a New York Times notable book. Arlene Heyman grew up in the suburbs of Newark, attended public schools there, and then graduated from Bennington College in Vermont. The year after graduation, she spent writing short stories in Madrid on a Fulbright fellowship, and then returned to the US to Syracuse University, where she received an MFA. For 6 years, while publishing short stories in the New American Review and other literary magazines, she taught freshman English and world literature at community colleges in upstate New York. She went on to become a physician, MD from University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and then fell in love with psychiatry and psychoanalysis. She lives in Manhattan, where she's in private practice and writes fiction, including the collection Scary Old Sex, and now the novel Artifact. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to give just a little supplementary introduction of Arlene and just say how we know each other, how we come to be doing this event together. So I first met Arlene when she was a student in my class at the 92nd Street Y. And that's actually, it's kind of a venerable institution, probably a lot of you know, and a lot of the students there are of extremely high quality. Often they're professional writers who are coming back after a hiatus or trying out a new genre. So at first, I did not realize what was happening when Arlene walked into my class, but then she submitted a short story called The Loves of Her Life, which it still haunts me to this day. I read it and it was, there's something very magical about when you read a writer at the top of her game, someone who's not just a great writer, but has an original voice, something you've never heard before, and they're saying something that you've never heard before. It's like a genuinely fresh and new take on life. So I actually, like, as a teacher, you get a little jaded, but with that story, I went around all week talking about it and trying to explain to people what was so amazing about it. And here we are, you know, several years later. Now Arlene is a multiply published and much lauded writer. So it's been wonderful to see that actually happen as it should, and does not always in real life. And I think we'll talk about like the difficulties Arlene had before in getting to that point, which she absolutely should not have had, but the world is an unjust place. So I just wanted to put in that like enthusiasm before we go to the reading, where you will begin to get a taste of that for yourself. So Arlene, would you like to read?
I would, but I want to say thank you for those lovely comments. And I want to say something of my experience with you at the Y, and explain how I got to be here today, because that has a lot to do with you. I took this class, I think I was the oldest person in the class. And I watched your style, how you dealt with people's manuscripts, and I found the whole class lovely, inspiring, and I went on. And then when the class was over, I joined a writing group made up of some of the people from the class. And at one point I realized there was a woman there, I'm blocking her name, and that she was paying you to help her edit a manuscript that she was doing. It was about something that took place in Greek or Roman times. And I thought, gee, Sandra functions as an editor. I knew you as a writer, but I didn't realize you also functioned as an editor. And so I asked, since the criticisms that you had given me in class were simply superb, they were right, you got what I was doing. I asked, would you be willing to edit some of my stories? And you did. And a footnote I want to make is the fact that you're 30 years younger, 25 years, something like that, younger than I am. People don't need to have the classic idea that you can have a mentor must be someone older than you. A mentor can be younger than you. And you did a lovely thing for me. You helped with a story here and there. And then you said at one point, would I like to send my stories to your agent? And at that time I had an agent I wasn't very happy with. She was sending the book around. It was not getting accepted. And I said, sure. And so your agent read my stories and she took me on, and then she managed to find 3 publishing companies within a month of sending out the book who wanted to buy it. And that was just extraordinary. And it's got me launched. Up to then, I had been doing short stories that got published now and then, but this was the first book. So I'm very grateful to you. And everyone might as well know that whenever I get into trouble, I call Sandra. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? She's been immensely generous. Okay. So I'm going to read from the very beginning of Artifact. I'm going to read about 3 pages. It takes place in 1984, and I have an asterisk next to 1984. The asterisk goes to this footnote. This is a novel that takes place, for the most part, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Transitional periods in the lives of women. Of course, we are still in a transitional period in the lives of women, and so also in the lives of men. She did not want to disturb the rats. Breathing lullaby and good night, trying to keep the wire cage in her arms steady, she walked down the dimly lit hall. The lab equipment was turned off for the weekend, and there was no sound except for the soft slapping noise of her slippers and her low song. Occasionally, a rat lifted its head and sniffed the air. Lottie worked in a pair of cut-off dungarees and a t-shirt her gross anatomy class had given her, which showed the muscles of the chest and back labeled in Latin. Her dark blonde hair was twisted and piled up on top of her head with a test tube clamp. The radio said it was the hottest August night since 1945. On the highways to Long Island and the Jersey Shore, the traffic had been bumper to bumper all day. The cars bulging with sun umbrellas, baby carriages, bicycles tied to roofs. After dinner, when she had walked towards Central Park in search of a breeze, the close streets seemed to her vacant and forlorn. The charged life of the city dimmed in August. Most of her colleagues were on vacation. During the day, a few technicians came in, the department secretary, occasionally a worried graduate student. She liked being alone in her lab in the hushed city, undisturbed by the rhythms of others, a pleasure she didn't experience often now that she had small children again. Davy was 2 and Simon was 5, and they were wild, bucking things. Her 18-year-old Evelyn usually had friends over who sat in Lottie's study working on her home computer or making clothes for college on her sewing machine. Her husband, Jake, had private music students weekday afternoons and on Saturdays. And in August, his 14-year-old daughter, Ruth, blew in from LA like a small low-pressure front that brings a storm. She danced for and cooked with her dad, pointedly ignored the boys, and took pokes and jabs at her stepmother. Lottie tried not to poke or jab back, and she certainly never said what she often thought. Fly away, little girl. Go home. Disappear. She tried to schedule a major experiment every August. On the counter, the caged rats shifted restlessly in the moonlight. She switched on the tensor lamp at the dissecting table and the light above the sink, tied herself into a faded green surgical gown, drew on a workman's glove, and ran the cold water. She slid open the lid of the cage, gripped the nearest quivering animal, and lifted it out. She raised the paper cutter blade and positioned the animal's head on the platform, his squirming body just off the edge. His pink feet kicked the air. He began defecating black pellets, urinating in spasms on her glove. She brought the blade down, crunching through the bottom of his neck. The head lay on the platform. Lottie held tight to the body, which continued to struggle, spraying blood through the open neck. Her cheek was suddenly wet. Thrusting the body under the cold water, she held on until it quieted and stopped. Then she dumped it into a plastic bag and laid the head on the dissecting table. She shook the glove off and, taking up the scalpel and forceps, dissected out the sublingual and submandibular salivary glands, easing them into a beaker of fixative. She washed her face, barely seeing its wavy, dim features in the tarnished paper towel dispenser, and reached into the cage for the next rat. She liked to set a rhythm, do what had to be done steadily and speedily. The smell of blood was in the room now, and the rats knew. They squawked in their cage even before she touched them, and no matter how firmly she held on, they wouldn't lie still. In the air-conditioned room, she was sweating. Lottie had been intermittently irritable the last few months, ever since a microscopy journal that had solicited a paper from her had sent it back for extensive revisions. She had developed new techniques for spotlighting each organelle of a particular cell in the salivary gland, the function of which no one understood, although it was implicated in several diseases, one of them fatal. The journal's referees had savaged her paper, from the typing to the heart of the work. She was not describing the actual cell at all, nor the real components of the mucus, but only the distortions created by the very techniques she was advocating. One critic finished up, "This paper is not acceptable for publication since it is replete with accidental and random findings. It is no more than a collection of artifacts." Lottie had read the lines twice, then crushed the critiques into a ball and stuffed it into the bottom drawer of her desk. A month later, a small grant proposal of hers was rejected. She'd heard from a colleague in Washington that if only she'd cited a few papers by committee members or invited one of them to give a seminar at her place. The following week, her chairman phoned. He had heard about the grant and thought it was unjust. She was one of the most productive people in the department, with a bibliography second in length and quality only to his own. The graduate students stood online for her seminars. She was innovative. She was creative. Unfortunately, he had bad news for her himself. Lottie said, "No promotion." He was terribly sorry. She must be aware she was on a frozen budget line. Actually, they were all small animals caught in a glacier, if he could speak for a moment from the paleontological point of view. The state was cutting back funding. NIH was tightening its belt. There was nothing he could do. Next year, it would be a different ball game. She could rest assured he'd go to bat for her then. It was the third year he'd handed her that wilted bunch of metaphors, and her husband told her to sue. He said, "It's discrimination against women, and you're just sitting back and taking it." He cited a microbiologist, a woman well known in her field, who'd said in a recent New York Times article, quote, "Women scientists have two choices, bitterness or foolishness," end quote. Lottie said she wasn't famous enough to make resounding judgments, and if she let herself get involved with lawyers, she wouldn't get her work done. Jake said, at least, Jake is the husband, at least go to the grievance committee. There must be a grievance committee. What do they call it? Human resources. We need the money, end quote, Lottie said. I'm not licking ass. Jake said, who asked you to lick ass? Go in and yell. You're not yelling. You only yell at me. You're mute. Sandra, you're mute. You're mute. You've got to unmute yourself. Nobody.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Thank you. Typical. Okay. So I love that. I'm just going to repeat what I said while I was muted. I love that section. And I especially love that. I really admire how you introduce Lottie, and the first thing that we see her do is cut off a rat's head and be sprayed in the face with the rat's blood while the other rats scream in terror. What a way to introduce a protagonist. And I wanted to ask you about that. And later on, we see her doing like the cardinal sin of all, being a bad mother, which is really, really bold. Like I stop at that section every time. And also like her sexuality, the way she's demanding about her sexuality when she wants sex, but then there's a certain point where a man is being incredibly generous to her, but she won't sleep with him because she just doesn't want to. Were you ever worried that the readers would see her as unsympathetic? And did you care? Like, do you think the concept of unsympathetic characters is meaningful?
A confession. I didn't see her as unsympathetic.
I'm not saying that I do. I'm just.
Pardon me?
I'm not saying that I found her unsympathetic, but she has her moments where she's, I guess, like not your typical lovable person.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I say a confession, I didn't find her unsympathetic. I guess it's my blind spot that made me not see that. I'm thinking the short story that you mentioned earlier, The Loves of Her Life. When I was in that writing group, a man in that writing group, and I blocked his name too, said, that character is so selfish. It was a woman. She's so selfish. It's impossible. The whole story is no good. I can't stand the character. It was very unsettling. I think actually you commented when you looked at, I gave you 800 pages. We've got it down now to about 275. You said Lottie seems not to be aware that she's putting herself first and her children, her child, and that time she had one child, Evelyn, her child second. And that makes her unappealing. So I thought about that. I thought, Sandra's right. So I made her feel guilty. That is, I made her aware of what she was doing. I made her feel bad about it, which is reasonable that she should feel bad, but she had to do it anyway. And I guess what I think is that people are a mix of good traits and then traits that you don't like. I mean, we feel that even about ourselves. There are things about ourselves we don't like. And it's hard for me to imagine a character who is not, in some respects, unsympathetic. And I would cite two literary examples. One is Madame Bovary, right? And she holds our attention for the entire novel, Madame Bovary. She's despicable. She really is despicable. What she does to her husband and her children, she ignores them completely, but she fascinates us. Now, Lottie is not despicable in any way. She's struggling to get ahead and to be who she is. She wants to be a good mother. She would like to do all those things, but she's got troubles with it. I think it makes her more appealing, that she's more human. Mm-hmm. Exemplars, for some reason, after I say exemplar, I'm thinking of Trump, who's I don't know if there's a dexemplar word. There must be some word for what he is. But people who are so terrible that you can't find anything good in them, or people who are so good that you can't find anything bad in them. I don't know. I would say they don't exist, except I feel in our president's case, he has no reclaiming features, but I don't want to get into politics. I was thinking of another book too. Maybe, I don't know if you know this book. It's called The Kindly Ones by Jonathan Littell. He's an American, but he's lived in France much of his life. He's probably not older than you are. And this is about a 900-page book told from the point of view of an SS officer. It's historically researched beautifully. It won many prizes, and that is a despicable character, and he gets away with it. And because he knows perfect French, he lives in France after the war. No one captures him. You see his complicity in murders of Jews. It's a historical novel, so you learn a tremendous amount reading it. Some people were fascinated by that character. Other people gave up the book halfway through, and they said, this man is so disgusting, I can't stand it. And they quit. Now, Lottie she yells at her kids once in a while, and she really calls it sacrificing rats. That's what the scientists call it. And they save people's lives from the information they get killing rats. I think her stepdaughter makes a deal about it too, says, how could you do that? So I hope that it will make her more appealing as a character, that she has sandpaper here or there, in addition to her warm, lovable, intelligent qualities.
Yeah, that's interesting that it's funny, we were talking about the word relatable just before this, and the idea that to be relatable, a character actually has to be unsympathetic to some degree, because otherwise they're no longer a person. Okay, so one thing, just going on with a little bit in this vein, to a large degree, Lottie's story is a story of the men in Lottie's life, which I think is kind of inevitable. And there's a really telling section where Lottie's disappointed that her first child is a girl. And then when that child, Evelyn, she begins to be old enough to crawl, she prefers her father. So there's this line, Lottie's annoyed that as soon as Ev could crawl, she would make a beeline for Charlie. Did everyone prefer boys? So I think every part of that description it's very honest about the psychology of women in the 20th century. And this is a book about women in the 20th century. And I wonder, do you think that's changed? Do you think that it's less true that boys are instinctively, viscerally preferred by everyone? And how damaging do you think that was, that feeling that women are just a priori less?
I think we are struggling, women and men too, women are struggling to get equality. I don't think we have it. And the visceralness, I think it's culture that makes boys preferred to girls, not anything instinctive in us. We live in a patriarchal culture, and boys are still preferred. I think it's somewhat less, it's becoming less. Women are going into more professions, and in some professions which have been classically male, like law and medicine, the numbers of women law students and medical students are greater than the numbers of men. So there are some changes, but the amount of domestic violence that still goes on, and what men and women alike absorb from the culture, we haven't had a woman president yet. And it's true, we have more women members of Congress. But until you really see equal numbers out in the world and in the United States, women are not taken seriously as equals. Right now, we're in the midst of protests that African Americans are very tired of being second-class citizens. Have things gotten better for them? Yes, but they're still being killed in large numbers. And the number of women being damaged in their homes. Right now, during this COVID disaster, in England, there were newspaper articles about the increase in domestic violence in England. Now, women take in from the culture the same thing men take in from the culture. They just are not so aware. I don't even know how aware men are. It's the air we breathe. I'm remembering being in an elevator with 3 men, and they were all very big. And suddenly I was very aware that I was in a very fragile physical position. No one was threatening me in there, but I felt moved to make some comment to the effect of, I'm glad you guys are not threatening types. It's every once in a while it comes into one. And also what comes into one is a sense of inferiority. And it has nothing to do with penis envy. It's not, Freud was mistaken about that. And other psychoanalysts subsequently have picked that up. Little boys are envious of little girls, and little girls are envious of little boys. This is a kind of universal phenomenon. But the culture makes clear who's important, who's more important, who's less important. So we have quite a distance to go. We do have the vote, so that's good. But we have quite a distance to go in order to reach a state where feminism isn't a necessary movement.
Let me just follow up on that about Artifact. There are, in addition to the really complex and wonderful portrait of Lottie, you have a lot of, as I've just mentioned, portraits of men in the book. And we see the men like struggling with their role as men in the period in which they live and the changing role of men. Could you talk about the book as a book about manhood?
I'll do what I can. I have trouble making sociological or philosophical statements or general statements. I function best with a particular character that I can create.
The character who I think is most obviously doing this is George Kanajian. That character, he is very much the new man or trying to be the new man, and sometimes succeeding and sometimes not.
Well, he's a lovely man. This is a pediatrician who meets Lottie when her marriage has fallen apart, though she hasn't left her husband yet. And I think pediatricians are especially good people. Myself, I know that this doesn't hold in every case, but I have a daughter-in-law who's a pediatrician. She's a good woman. In general, people who want to take care of children or who are moved to do that, with the exception of those who want to abuse children and go into it for that reason. So you always have to keep your eyes and ears open in this life. Pediatricians have a propensity towards helping out others. This man is working in the hospital he's a resident when Lottie first meets him. And later she moves in with him, and he's extremely patient with her because she's known her husband since she was 6 or 7 or 8 and been with him forever. So when she moves in with this man, the idea of some kind of sexual life with him is foreign to her and not acceptable to her. And he has her living there for months and months. And in the beginning and in the end, he helps her get to graduate school, to realize she can do more than be a lab tech, which is where she was, what she was doing when he met her. So he's very nurturant. Men can be very nurturant. these are not gender exclusive traits. And there are men who are gentler than women. He's a very gentle person, and he does put up with a lot, perhaps too much, I don't know, but he's very helpful to her. So the three men in the book are good men. I like men very much. In my life, men have been very good to me. I have two sons, and I'm very proud of both of them are good men. Lottie meets good men, and she has the good fortune to marry them. There is I don't know if you would call him a villain in the book. There's a bad guy too. But he's not a major character in the book. And I did something, not consciously, but I did it. That is, the guy who turns out to be rather dreadful is a poet. Is a writer, a poet. Her first husband, on the other hand, who's really a decent guy, is a football player. So I did not make the villainous man, the macho athlete type. On the contrary. So in your original question about men in the 20th century, or men trying to be good, I think that the idea of what a good man is has changed. Still, men and women, it's very important to earn a living, especially if you have to take care of children. And that's always fallen on men very heavily. That's to be a good man is to earn a good living. And now I think men are expected also to be good fathers, and women are expected to earn livings. It's more and more emerging of what it is to be a good human being, to be a good partner, a good parent if you have children, a good breadwinner. It's hard being a good person.
Okay, I'm just going to go on from that to one of the themes that comes up again and again in Artifact is the conflict between having a career, and particularly a scientific intellectual career, and raising children. And I just want to mention that what I think is a famous quote, but it's Cyril Connolly. It's often attributed to Graham Greene, but it's really Cyril Connolly said, "There is no more somber enemy of good art than the pram and the hall." Do you think that is necessarily true? Do you think that there is a natural conflict, or do you think that's manufactured by society?
I think it's very much, well, what to do. I mean, when you have children, you care about them. So it is something of interest and importance to you. But one always in life has more than one thing of importance. To live a life and just right and not have someone you love deeply, be that a man, woman, that's a sad business. And you need some experience in the world of different types. To love someone is important. And to have children, whether that's an enemy of art, I think depends very much on the partner that you have. Whether you're a man with a man, a woman with a woman, a woman with a man, you have children, you need to have somebody to help you out with those children. And if you have a partner who sees it as his or her equal responsibility, then you can both get things done. And if you have a little money, you can hire help. And that is a big advantage. That is a big advantage. So I would say no. I don't think, unless you have a terrible spouse, and then you should get out of there anyway, rather than stick with someone who won't share burdens. No, having children, you learn something about the world. It's an important piece of experience. There are many kinds of experience that are important, and that's one of the possible experiences that can help you as a writer.
Okay, change of tack. So I'm partly bringing this up because this is one of my favorite sentences in the book that I always stop at and think about. When all of this had come upon her, she didn't know. Slowly, imperceptibly, like a pound or two gained every year but overlooked, until one day in passing an interior mirror, she saw with surprise a very substantial figure, responsible, solid, a matron. And I think that really captures something about being a middle-aged person with a career, with a family, with a life that has built up and become something that wasn't exactly planned for, but is very full and alive and complicated. And there's something about Lottie. Lottie, when we meet her, she's very happily middle-aged. She's content with her cesarean scarred middle-aged body and her complexly entangled middle-aged life, which is something we don't see very much in literature, I think, which is odd considering that writers tend to be pretty middle-aged themselves. So do you have a theory about why that would be? Why writing is so focused on people in their 20s who are finding their partner, their first partner in life and falling in love?
I'm not sure. I was just thinking that when I chose something to read from Artifact, I started at the beginning. The publicity agent from Bloomsbury, I asked her, what do you think I should read? And she said, well, you can read these 3 pages at the beginning. Well, she also gave me 3 pages, about 2/3 of the way through the book. If I read the few pages that were 2/3 of the way through the book, I had a lot of explaining to do because my audience, all of you out there listening to us tonight, hasn't read the book, or some of them haven't read the book. And I think somehow if you start with the first marriage in a novel, you're starting at the beginning. It's less encumbered, less complicated, and it has some, besides simplicity, it has a certain plastic Hollywood quality to it. Like it's new, everything is new, you're out there in the world without encumbrances. So there's something of the ideal and the beautiful, the first marriage. By the time you get to the second marriage, it's a lot messier and you're a lot less attractive. We have Hollywood, the beauty of men and women is very important in all of us, and it must affect writers too. So first marriages are kind of easier to deal with. They're more pneumatic. So I think that's why also people, they start out young as novelists. So, and it takes a long time to get that first book out. So you may be rewriting that first one with the first marriage for quite some time. But I think it's something about perfection and simplicity. It's the way it ought to be. It shouldn't be with C-section scars and hanging breasts and all the things that happen to us and bellies. Men get their bellies. It's less appealing.
Okay, I'm just going to ask one more question and then we can go to the viewers' questions. You have said that your long friendship with Bernard Malamud was very important in your development as a writer and thinker. I know you've got the actual quote from the Auden poem here, which I misremembered as being that he was an intellectual climate for you. But could you say more about how his work and his thinking has affected you as a writer and a person?
Yeah, and I'll give you the quote, which is, it's this, there are 2 wonderful poems of Auden's that I love. And one is In Memory of Sigmund Freud, and that's where this quote comes from. The other one is about William Butler Yeats, which is also in memory of William Butler Yeats when he dies. So go back to the Sigmund Freud quote. I use some of this about Bernard Malamud. Now, obviously, Bernard Malamud is not a figure of the size of Sigmund Freud, so understanding that. But to a young woman, I met him when I was 19. He had a lot of heft to him. And the line, as written by Auden, goes about Freud: if often he was wrong and at times absurd, to us he is no more a person now but a whole climate of opinion under whom we conduct our different lives. So I think that I always intended to be a writer from when I was 3 or 4. But meeting Bernard Malamud at Bennington College was immensely helpful. First of all, he was a Jew and I was a Jew. Neither one of us practicing, but it was a strong identification that I had. He came from a very poor background. I came from a lower middle class background. My father was a salesman, a wholesale salesman. My mother was a grade school teacher with a 2-year college education. His father was a grocer, and his mother just worked in the house, and he really had poverty. There weren't books in the house, there was nothing. And he had somehow made of himself a writer who won a couple of Pulitzer Prizes, National Book Awards. He got all the awards you could get in this country. I think he got everything but a Nobel Prize. So to see someone who had come out of that kind of background made me feel, I could do it too. Now, it's chutzpah because he worked very hard. It wasn't easy. He worked all the time. He was single-minded. He didn't get himself 2 careers. He wasn't a psychoanalyst, a psychiatrist, and also a writer. So I think I was overreaching. He's also a tremendously gifted human being. But it was encouraging to me to watch somebody who come out of that kind of background. And I thought, I can go where I want. It helped me. I was never consciously aware of feeling inferior as a woman, but I assume everything that's in the culture we all absorbed. So this was very helpful to me. And then some of his characteristics as a person, I'm actually the opposite of a lot of them. For instance, he always edited his own work. He felt letting somebody else edit your work was, he said, if you have a bad back, you have to do your exercises yourself, right? Nobody else can do your exercises. Now I edit the best I can, but I'm blinder than he was. And you've been immensely helpful in looking at this and saying, I think those 3 characters, you need to make them 1 character. And I'm very grateful for that. But still, he's kind of model of do it yourself, of economy. He balanced his checkbooks to the last penny, and he hated himself for balancing them to the last penny. I've balanced a checkbook once in my life altogether. So it's this kind of an austere model that I can hold up there while I live completely differently. He got up at a certain time and he always did his writing a certain number of hours. I'm much more, I'm glad if I get myself to sit down and I put in some time. So these kind of a model in many ways.
Okay, I know I said that was my last question, but I'm just gonna, first, well, actually if people in the audience want to ask questions, you can do that in the chat. So you can just type in questions, which you should be doing now. While I ask this one more question, which is about, so you brought up Freud, so I have to ask this about Freud. So do you think that being a psychoanalyst and thus to some degree an intellectual follower of Freud affects your writing?
I'm thinking about James Joyce and Leopold Bloom walking around Dublin, hearing a clock going cuckoo, cuckoo, cuckoo. And he's thinking cuckold, 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 because he's being cuckolded and he knows it, that his wife is sleeping with someone else. Now, that's a kind of Freudian insight that we have unconscious fantasies, and Bloom is trying very hard not to think about what's going on in his house while he's wandering around Dublin, but it keeps coming back. And I think Freud would talk about unconscious fantasies, the power of it. You're trying to deny something, repress something, but it keeps coming back. It's hard for me to say exactly how Freud has affected me, except that I know that the mind is sneakier than I thought before I studied Freud and listened to people. There's so much we tried to block out. And Freud's biggest discoveries were that there's an unconscious and that it affects us tremendously. So I think that I'm aware of that all the time when I'm writing about characters. And sometimes when I read something I've written, when I read it 10 years later, I see things in my unconscious that I didn't know 10 years before. And I often think, oh no, I did that. All right. I mean, even Lottie's killing rats, when I looked at that about 10 years ago, I thought, I wonder if she's getting rid of her siblings. What are rats after all? Are they little children, you know? So that went through my head and I thought, oh my God, look at this. So, you know, something you've studied for years and years, it infiltrates your mind, your flesh, but I can't say precisely how it affects my writing, except that I hope the characters are complicated.
Okay, so I've got a question here from Ruben.
Ruben?
Yes.
My son, my younger son.
Traditionally, we think of psychiatrists as needing to be blank slates for their patients. Writing a book is public. How does being a public writer interact with patient care?
Good question. Good question. I was asked this question when the first book came up, some version of it, slightly different, but how it interacts with patient care is as follows. You see what the person makes of it, because your patient is going to notice things about you. If you keep a stiff upper lip and you show no emotion in your face, the patient will notice that. And it would be to your advantage to realize that this is what the patient is seeing and this is how you come across. And what does that do to the patient or for the patient? So in the same way, I'm in my office right now. This is a particular kind of office. Somebody else will have a very different kind of office. Everybody's got an office. Everybody has a body. Everybody has a personality. And you can't keep it away from your patients. They see it. So you don't want to shrink your life. If you can write something, write it. Do your best to live a full life, my son, Ruben, I'll tell you that. And then see what the patient makes of it. Patients make all kinds of things of it. They may be envious. It may encourage them. You wouldn't believe what anybody makes of it. So you have to ask, be aware of it, and see how it hits people. But don't try to become neutral. You can't. You can't. You don't bring yourself in, but if somebody reads your book and they comment on it, then you want to know, what do they think? And how does it affect them? And how does it affect the relationship with you? In other words, analyze it. Be aware of it. Make sense of it. Because it's different with each person.
Okay, we've got one. This is more of a comment than a question, but it's the right kind of comment. It's from Stephanie Aline. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but hello, Arlene. I'm Stephanie Aline. I had the wonderful task of narrating the audiobook of Artifact. I wanted to say how good I think your book is, as well as wonderful characters and a great story. The rhythm of your writing was wonderful to read aloud. I absolutely loved doing it. So that's nice. And now we have a question from Claire Carroll. Did you have a vision of the overall arc of the story when you started writing the novel, or was the plot unfolded to you over the process of writing? Does character or plot come first or together? Why? How does that work for you?
Does character, could you repeat that? Does
character come first or does plot come first? So do you have a vision of the overall arc, and does character or plot come first?
Okay. Let me say two things. One, I want to thank the reader of my book, the audio book, for listening to this and that she loved what she was reading. I haven't listened to it yet, but I'm looking forward to hearing it. So thank you for coming and making that comment. And then this is Claire Carroll, and Claire is a professor of comparative literature at Queens College. And that's an interesting question. I'll tell you, for me, character comes first. I have a character trait in mind, might be a bit of somebody that I know or knew. Artifact started because one of my dearest friends, Joanne Simpson, is a scientist, and I never had a friend who was a scientist. It just interested me very much. So I pulled that, and then I had to figure something to do with her. And I worked that out. So for different writers, it must be very different, but it's character. And I suppose that's why I'm a psychoanalyst too, because people's characters interest me, who people are. So that's where I start. I do have notes, so I try to figure out where I'm taking them. I can't just write without knowing where I'm going, so I have to figure it out. Though as I go along, I go to places I didn't expect to go at all. In some of those places, Sandra said, you shouldn't go there. When she edits, she says, no, no, no. But in general, I follow character. I like people very much. They interest me tremendously.
Okay. And here's a question from Eitan Koch. I don't know.
Eitan Koch.
Okay, thank you. How do your patients feel about your writing? Do they read your books? Do they worry, or are they proud that somehow they're being represented in your work?
I'm a little in trouble with this question because I don't want to breach patient confidentiality at all. So if I talk about current patients and how they react to my work, I don't think I should do that. Mm-hmm. How can I? I'm trying to think, can I take a past patient? Would that be legitimate to do? Or would that not be legitimate? That's probably not legitimate to do either. I'm just thinking, should I generalize? I don't know how to handle that question, Eitan. It's a very good question. I don't know what to do with it exactly. Given that I'm a practicing psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, the one thing I could say, each person is completely different, one from another. So the importance is to find out. I can say this, it hasn't derailed anybody yet. It hasn't made anybody say, I'm getting out of here. I don't want to see you anymore. People have gotten angry, and some people are pleased, but everybody is completely different.
Do you think it helped anyone?
Pardon me?
Do you think it's helped anyone?
I think that that people think, if she can do it, maybe I can do it too. That some people's attitude is that. I don't think it's hurt anyone. So as part of the Hippocratic Oath, first of all, do no harm. I think by writing, I don't write about my patients at all. That would be inexcusable to use patients in fiction without checking with them or asking them. So I think one should express oneself and then see what the patients think. Actually, his question is something like Rubin's question about being a psychiatrist and then writing a public book, the idea that you should be a completely private person. You can't, not with an internet. Nobody's people know everything about you. So unless you live like a mummy, a dead person, they're going to know things about you. And writing books is the same as doing anything else.
Okay. So one final question from Susan Lax. And this is a good, appropriate final question. If you had one heart lesson your reader could take away from the book, what would it be?
Susie is one of my daughters. It's my Machatenister. She's the mother of a daughter-in-law of mine. I have two daughters-in-law. So the question, Susie, is, Sandra, tell me again, if I had a heart lesson, H-E-A-R-T, or?
Yeah, one heart lesson your reader could take away from the book. It's a tough question. What would it be?
I would say this. First of all, no writer wants to give an answer to that question because it'll limit the book. It would make it smaller. And it would just be what's important. It would just be something that came to my mind about what's important in that book. And the thing about a work of art is that it has to speak to many people. So what it'll say to one person is different from what it'll say to somebody else. And even what it would say to me at one time in my life is different from what it would say to another at another time in my life. So I think to answer that question as a heart, I don't want to give anybody a message from the book. I want them to read the book, go into it, marinate themselves in the characters, and see what it says to them. It'll say something different to each person.
Okay, so since you dodged that question, you get one more.
Okay.
From Jonathan Sheenberg. Were there any lessons you learned from writing your book of short stories, Scary Old Sex, that proved helpful in writing your first novel?
I think so, actually, Jonathan. That's a good question. He's a very fine young man on the Upper West Side who took my phone to get the battery replaced because I did not want to go into a closed space at my age with COVID all over the place. Tell me the question again, Sandra, so that I've got it in mind.
Were there any lessons you learned from writing your book of short stories that proved helpful in writing your first novel?
I think the idea of being brave and not censoring oneself, taking chances, it worked very well in Scary Old Sex. I was surprised at how well received that was. I remember with the editor that I worked with, we had a question. The first story, which is the story you mentioned, The Loves of Her Life, the first editor thought maybe we should bury this story in the middle. I had it as the first story, right in the beginning. And I was of mixed feelings because it's a very shocking story. And I thought, should we bury the thing or not? I thought, God, everybody tries to be sensationalistic. You know, that'll catch people's opinion, catch people's attention. Why are we going to bury this in the middle? So I was quite confused about it. Anyway, we left it in the beginning, and the editors changed. I got a different editor. She left it in the beginning, and it didn't stop people. They didn't say, oh, I don't want to read this book. People were more bothered by killing rats, I think, than any sexual aspect. It's kind of let things out and test them out on some people who are not squeamish or prudish. Know who's squeamish and prudish, and don't read to them in the beginning. That readers appreciate your bravery because they feel shame, and like the rest of us, and they're shy. And if you try to be your bravest self, that may very well work. And I think that I tried to do that in rewriting Artifact, working it over. I've worked it over for a long time. So, and also Scary Old Sex, since that was so well received, I thought, I hope this one would be too. So that makes you braver also.
Well, thank you very much for your writing above all, and for your bravery, which is definitely the one of the things that that first short story so amazing for me, and which I value in all of your work. And everyone should immediately, if they have not already done so, buy Artifact. You will not regret it. And I think that's all. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. And
hello again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, both Sandra and Arlene.
thank you.
Love the reference to the kindly ones in the beginning. I feel like I'm always bringing up that book as a you know, something that represents you know, characters like that, but just other things too. So it's cool to hear that brought up. But anyway, excellent event. If you missed any of it, we'll have it on YouTube soon. And please buy the book. We have the link on the chat. And every book that you buy helps us put on more free events. And it'll be 10% off for a limited time. And you can also buy Arlene's first book and Sandra's latest book, The Heavens, as well. Thank you.
And I'd like to thank you for putting this event together, especially these times. There's writers love to hear what people think about their writing, because it's a lonely business, writing. So you want to be out in public, and now you can't be out in public. So this is a fine thing that you're doing for people. It's an independent bookstore.
Yes.
Powerhouse arena. We should support it. We should support all independent bookstores, especially this one. And I'm very grateful to you. I had a good time. I loved being with Sandra, and I loved the questions. I loved answering them, and I'm very appreciative.
Very appreciative of you for coming out and talking about your book with us.
Okay, thanks everyone.
So do we leave? What do we do?
I'll finish up the webinar now. Bye.
Bye.